Hello? Hello? Is it on? All right, great. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Brad Hornbeck. I'm from the Student Labor Action Project, or SLAP. Recently, I'm also part of a larger coalition of students who I recognize a lot of you tonight. We are the Boston United Campuses Against War and Racism. We formed 2 weeks ago and started off with 10 schools, and we mobilized for last Thursday's National Day of Student Action. And recently we picked up several more schools, including high schools. And so as of now, actually of Sunday, we're 14 schools and campus groups, individuals working on different things. So you should all be getting a flyer, if I made enough copies, with some information, including our email listserv, and you can all sign up for that and find out about upcoming events. Actually, our next meeting is Sunday, this coming up Sunday at 5:30 at Emerson College. It's 96 Beacon Street, but I'll remind you about that towards the end. Our first speaker tonight is a graduate student at MIT. She's also a participant in the Student Labor Action Project and part of the larger Boston Student Anti-War Coalition. She works mostly with the South Asian community and a specific group called the South Asian Center. Please welcome Payal Parekh.
I want to apologize from the forset if I'm a little bit scattered. I had to bike over here from Central Square, and a woman decided she didn't like bike riders today and hit the back of my wheel, so. But I made it, and on time. As Brad mentioned, my name is Payal Parekh, and I'm a graduate student at MIT. Today I'm representing the Student Labor Action Project and the Boston United Campuses Against War and Racism. The pace at which students have mobilized to voice their opposition to war and hate crimes is truly amazing. Last Thursday, there were rallies on 150 campuses throughout the nation, 10 right here in Boston. This was followed by a march in the evening from Copley Square to Harvard Square, in which over 1,500 people participated. I think we all deserve to give a big hand to the organizers of those marches. On my own campus at MIT, students of color have also been mobilizing. For while it is important to voice our opposition to bloodshed abroad, we must also organize to prevent bloodshed here. Already 3 people have been killed as a result of hate crimes. Just last week, a Sikh in Arizona was killed because 2 young people thought that he was an Arabic that was responsible for the terrorist attacks. Because the United States government decided, even prior to having any evidence that the terrorists were from the Arab world, Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians are being targeted for hate crimes. This is happening right here in Boston, not only in Texas and Arizona. Injustices include having racial slurs yelled at one or being denied access to a shop simply for wearing a chardon. In fact, myself, last Thursday, I walked out of my house and I had trash thrown at me, and I was told that Allah could fuck himself. A driver tried to run my friend off the road last week, and a convenience store owned by an American of Indian descent was torched in Somerset. Such behavior forces our fellow Arabic, Islamic, and South Asian friends to live in terror and fear in a supposedly free land. Not only are affected communities targets of hate crimes, but may have their civil liberties curtailed. Last week, a Pakistani gentleman was bumped off of his flight despite passing through a security check because other passengers felt unsafe. This is very reminiscent of the pre-civil rights era where separate but equal was in place. While security and safety are important, they cannot be used as reasons to curtail civil liberties for anybody. Today it may be Arab, Muslims, or South Asians. Tomorrow it could be any one of you. It is important to remember that crimes are the responsibility of the individuals who committed them, not any ethnic or religious groups. Since Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City federal courthouse, should we assume every white male from Michigan is a terrorist? In order to stop racism and hate, as well as protect our civil liberties, we must all speak out against racism, educate one another, and support each other. At MIT, the coalition of diverse student groups that has come together include Arabic, Islamic, South Asian, African, social justice groups, and student government. We are working together to organize workshops on safety for students that are targets of race crimes, an accompaniment program for those that would like an escort, seminars and workshops on Islam, and cultural programs to share our culture with others. The task before us is large, and these are small steps, but it is a start. If each of us makes a commitment to fighting racism rather than a war against an unidentified enemy, we will have made a difference.
Our next speaker is a program coordinator for the Middle East and Horn of Africa for Grassroots International. Grassroots provides financial and material support for communities working for social change in Latin America, the Middle East, and Caribbean. In the United States, it does education and public advocacy on behalf of its partners. Please welcome Saad Dajani.
Good evening, everybody. In trying to make sense of why such a tragedy has happened to us, we're not going to get much information from the media and much less from our government for that matter. We hear that it's because countries around the world and peoples around the world are jealous of our freedom, or because there's this massive homogeneous Islamic world that has a visceral hate for us and doesn't value human life anyway, and therefore express their hate in terms of terror. It's really too bad that it took such a tragedy to shake us out of complacency and the attitude that we can here sit in America and just take in the world as sound bites. We can be attentive to other peoples and countries when there's some crisis that concern us, and then we forget. Their lives go on, their miseries go on, but we're oblivious until another crisis erupts, and then we rediscover them as though for the first time, and on it goes. In the short time I have today, I want to make or talk about two different themes. One of them is to say a few words about the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how the U.S.'s unilateral support for Israel fuels the kind of rage and hate across many parts of the Islamic and Arab world that could contribute to such reactions as the tragedy of September 11th. And second, to connect this conflict to the experiences of Arabs and Arab Americans here in the U.S., the discrimination and the scapegoating of those who have been trying to speak out and work for a just peace. And this discrimination didn't occur since September 11th. It's been going on for decades. But as we're thinking about all our civil liberties, it's even more timely now. Briefly about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's really too bad that, again, the hype doesn't really help us. We hear from some quarters here among the so-called experts on terror and from voices in Israel in particular that Palestinians are part of this amorphous Islamic terror, and they're trying to group that struggle with this broader issue. But we're paying attention to Palestinians right now, perhaps a bit more so than usual, because it used to be terrorism that was a problem for Israel, or so we thought, and now we think that it's a problem that is ours as well. The flip side, which is encouraging, is that there have been an impressive number of voices that have diagnosed one of the roots of terror, and certainly one of the roots of the discontent and anger, in U.S. foreign policy, particularly our one-sided support of Israel. And Israel has not succeeded, at least till now, in trying to locate the Palestinian struggle within this terror that we're trying to destroy. If we look at U.S. foreign policy towards Israel and the Palestinians, we find that the U.S. has shielded Israel politically and diplomatically, and shored it up economically since its establishment, and certainly even more so since the 70s. And here are a few highlights of that kind of support. For example, in 1947, when Palestine was partitioned into two states, it was really U.S. pressure that got the Majority Committee recommendation to partition through, when there was another committee that had advocated and talked about keeping it as a single state for both people. Did you know that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, are recognized by the international community as occupied territories? But here in the U.S., we've been on a slippery slope, referring to them alternatively as contested territories and now disputed territories, no longer occupied. Did you know that the U.S. has vetoed over 33 UN Security Council resolutions that call for some kind of action or censure on Israel for many of its transgressions? Did you know that we give Israel about $5 billion annually, and this is both the economic and military aid, as well as the interest accrued, as well as money to buy weapons and so on? Did you know that American-made weapons are killing Palestinians today, civilians? Did you know that the international community has resolved that settlements are illegal, the annexation of Jerusalem is null and void, Palestinians have the right of return to their homes. Israeli action since the Intifada of last year has been condemned as excessive violence, war crimes, crimes against humanity even. Did you know also that since the so-called peace process, and even more publicly since 1997, the U.S. has vouched publicly to Israel that it would abide by Israel's decisions as to if and whether it would redeploy from Palestinian areas and what the contours of a final settlement would look like. All of this requires a much longer discussion, of course, but points to unilateral U.S. support of Israel in defiance of the will of the international community and, of course, at the expense of Palestinian rights. Let me briefly touch upon the second point, which is also connected, that of the restriction of liberties, civil liberties of Arab Americans, that is in fact connected to our policy in the Middle East. If we hear the media today, you tend to hear politicians almost talk from two sides of their mouths. On the one hand, they say zero tolerance for any hate crimes or scapegoating of innocent citizens. Yet on the other hand, you hear them saying, we're going to war against Islamic terror. So it's not surprising that many Americans are confused and don't know what to make of it. People of Arab origin have been coming to this country for about 100 years and are maybe now in their fourth or even fifth generation. There are about 2.2 to 3 million Arab Americans, and the Muslim population is said to be between 6 and 7 million. There were two big waves of Arabs coming to this country, one before World War II and the second after. I'm simplifying things, but the reason why it's important to distinguish that phase is because a second wave of immigrants came from countries, recently independent countries, after British and French and other colonialisms were removed. And so they came with a better sense of a political identity and a national identity, and the issues that they had also lived through, including the establishment of Israel in '48 and the dismantling of the Palestinian society there, the occupation of 1967, and so on. Now, although Arabs were discriminated against in this country by race, they couldn't figure out whether we're going to be called Turks or Asians or yellow people or white people or what. The issue which has most shaped the experience of Arab Americans in this society isn't race as such, but it's the fallout of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's kind of ironic that that for decades we've been made into these visible political scapegoats and somehow held responsible, both here in the Arab world, for the problems of U.S. policy in the Middle East. And everybody claims to know us. You know, you watch a film on, a Hollywood movie, and you think, okay, that's what Arabs are like, and everybody thinks they have the authority to speak for us and reduce our behavior and beliefs and values into religion or culture. And yet, a lot of Americans have never met any Arab Americans. Starting in the 50s, but especially since the 60s and beyond, the contest over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been single-handedly almost defined the Arab American experience in the U.S. and the racism and discrimination against Arab Americans. It was around this time that we began to see the emergence of pro-Israel groups, both Jewish and non-Jewish, gearing up to assert their perspective of events in the Middle East in the American arena, and Arab American groups were also emerging at the same time for the same issue, although some had existed before as well. And it became a contest over who could establish the truth in the minds of the American public, what is regarded as a valid and legitimate course of events and history in that area. And with that, it became inevitable that the critics of Israel, both Arab American, and other Americans, would be vilified and silenced. And the government also had a role to play in all that. I can't do more than give a few highlights of that, but there are two organizations, and I know this is going to sound shocking to some and not very welcome to some people as well, but there are two organizations, pro-Israel organizations, the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, and AIPAC, that have played major roles in silencing debates about Israel, labeling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, defaming dissidents, interfering with their employment, preventing speaking engagements, and so on. A lot of this is documented, and if there's time later, I'll share with you some more specifics. But some of you may remember the case of, I think it was the San Francisco area in California, where the ADL was involved in colluding with the FBI in surveilling individuals and groups who were active, not only Arab Americans. They had a list of 10,000 individuals and about 500 groups, and sharing information about these people and groups with each other, with the FBI, and with, they thought, foreign governments, including Israel. But there are other examples as well that I'll skip over for now. At the government level here in the U.S., there have been a series of laws passed over the last decade or two that disproportionately have affected Arabs and Arab Americans that are gradually being reinforced right now as we speak to tighten the noose around not only us, the Arab American community, but every American who wants to express dissent against U.S. policy. We're going to see a bit more of this as we go along. Anti-terrorism laws that, there was one passed just yesterday, but anti-terrorism laws go back quite a bit. I was looking over some material to bring with me today, and I came across some information from the Reagan era where there was an attempt to pass an anti-terrorism law that would basically monitor so-called involvement with terrorist groups. And this was at the time of Israel's invasion of Lebanon, in which I was in Lebanon at that time. So it's kind of ironic that the monitoring should be for Arab groups almost exclusively. Of the laws that are worth mentioning today and that are also being tightened right now, the Airport Profiling Act of 1996 that really ended up singling out Arab Americans, Muslims, and other Arabs. And you can hear just the cases going on today about how this profiling is being used. The anti-terrorism law of our Act of 1996 that came in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing and the World Trade Center of 1993 expanded FBI surveillance. It also had to do with monitoring people who were linked to so-called terrorist organizations overseas, not here in the U.S., and it talked about suspected membership in such groups as grounds for deportation. And this is also being, or had been supported and is being supported by the secret evidence clauses or laws, which allow for secret evidence to be presented by so-called experts and others to justify detaining people and or deporting them. And even the lawyers in those cases don't have access to some of the information. Until September the 11th, I think the 20 or 25 people who were being detained under the secret evidence laws were Arab and Muslim. Now, all of these laws are guaranteed to be strengthened right now. They're going to be strengthened, as we're seeing. Each time you switch on the radio, you hear something from Ashcroft and something from somebody else talking about the new wiretapping, the internet monitoring, and so on. And though we may not be able to stop all terror, I think as citizens of the United States, the best way we can deal with terror isn't to scapegoat innocent people, isn't to lash out at people who seem Arab or Muslim, but it is to be informed about U.S.
We're going to try and get the house lights on a little bit more. We just don't know which breaker it is. We don't want to do it in the middle of a speech.
No one knows where it is. Sorry. That's better. Oh, even better. We get even more than that.
I know.
More house lighting. I guess that's it. It's pretty crude.
Is that good?
Yeah,
Is that good?
that's better. At least I can see someone. Yeah.
All right.
Great.
So a little better. All right. Well, I just like to thank all. While I'm up here for a second, I just like to thank all the speakers for coming here tonight. And also our friends, our allies at Mass Art, who got this room and put this all together for us the last minute. So I think that's good if we can stop playing with the lights and start going in. Our next speaker is an editor from the South End Press. He's an editor of Iraq Under Siege, The Deadly Impact of Sanctions and War. He's also a member of the International Socialist Organization in Providence, Rhode Island. Please give a warm welcome for Anthony Arnrove.
So first of all, I want to thank everyone who was involved in organizing tonight and all the fantastic work that we've seen in Boston over the last week. I think they deserve a round of applause. The New York Times had a headline on Sunday. I don't know if people saw it. I was in Kentucky over the weekend, so it may have been a different edition. It was the national edition. The headline said, "Forget the past. America prepares to fight a new war." And I'm not going to offer a history lesson when we have Howard Zinn here, but I will suggest that we should ignore the kind advice of the New York Times editors, and that we can learn a few things if we look at the past. And while the refrain we hear in the media over and over again is that the world changed on September 11th, radically changed, I actually want to talk about some of the continuities between the world before September 11th and the world after September 11th. Because if we don't understand those continuities, if we don't talk about those continuities and do something to change those continuities, we will not have done anything to prevent another September 11th from happening here or elsewhere in the world. And I think that that's very important, because that's why I hope we're here tonight. And I especially want to stress that last point, because so much of the media discourse has been about U.S. interests and making sure that this never happens again in the United States. But I think that we really have to make sure that this happens nowhere again. And we have to make sure that the media does not define the limits of what people in the world we care about and which terrorist acts we oppose and what violence we condemn. In the words of U.S. politicians and the rhetoric of the people we see speaking on the television screens, terrorism is only something that is done against the United States and against its allies. It has never done something by the United States or by its allies, and that is simply not an acceptable definition of terrorism. And the fact of the matter is, the United States is responsible for terrorism. I'm only going to touch on some of the instances of it. And its allies are responsible for terrorism, often it's its clients, as in the example of Israel that Suad pointed out. And that our struggle has to be in that violence, not to avenge just to avenge the violence of September 11th. Now I want to read from two small articles that were in the New York Times last week. They were small items, but they illustrate something that I want to talk about tonight. The first was a small report about the confirmation of the next U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. In the rush of legislation that's been pushed through in the last couple weeks, the Senate confirmed John Negroponte to be the U.S. representative to the UN. Now, that's a pretty small detail, you could say. Certainly, John Negroponte has experience in the U.S. diplomatic corps. In fact, from 1981 to 1985, he was the U.S. ambassador to Honduras. During that time, the Honduran government was sponsoring state terrorism against civilians in Honduras. Death squads, right-wing paramilitaries, tremendous state violence against civilians, peasant organizers, labor organizers throughout Honduras. And John Negroponte, the U.S. representative in Honduras, was sending cables back to Washington saying that there was no violence, that these were rumors, that there was no evidence of human rights violations by the Honduran government, despite tremendous documentation that those were being sponsored by the government with U.S. aid and assistance. Now, I think that's worth thinking about for a minute, because in the desire, as we're told, to defend democracy, to defend freedom, to defend the tremendous privileges and civil liberties that are embodied in the United States, we're told, the Senate rushed through the confirmation of someone who covered up and was involved in acts of state terrorism against people in Honduras. And I think that says something that we should pay attention to. It's worth reading the obituary section of the New York Times as well. You get to find out which past dictators that the United States support passed away this week. And one of them that passed away this week was a man named Marcos Pérez Jiménez, who was the former dictator who came to power in Venezuela in the 1940s in a bloody military coup. Let me read you, this is some details about this wonderful individual that appeared in the New York Times. General Pérez Jiménez forced many former associates into exile and tortured, murdered, and incarcerated hundreds of other opponents. The National University was closed, independent labor unions were abolished, and the press was intimidated. The main pillar of General Pérez Jiménez's rule was the much-feared National Security Police Force. Government spending on education and health was slashed, and earnings from oil sales were diverted into lavish, costly, and often superfluous construction projects. But because Jiménez was the dictator of a country that happened to sit on a lot of oil, Venezuela being one of the major oil suppliers to the United States, and because he welcomed Western investment and U.S. oil companies into the country, he was a friend of the United States, and in 1954, he was awarded the Legion of Merit by the U.S. government. Now, those are small examples of something that I think has received far too little attention in the U.S. media, which is the gap between the image of the United States, the image that the media and the government presents of its role on the world stage, and what's the actual role of the United States is on the world stage. Martin Luther King, when he came out against the Vietnam War, when he was speaking at teach-ins like this teach-in, and taking tremendous risks, because people in the civil rights movement were urging him not to speak out against the war, he said this. He said that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, which is something that seems shocking, seems contradictory. It seems at odds with perceived understanding. But the reality of the matter is I think that that statement is sadly more true today than when King said it in 1967. I think it's true if you look at the situation of Iraq. Just the most basic indicator you can look at, under 5 child mortality. A study by UNICEF found that 500,000 children under 5 have lost their lives as an impact because of the impact of the embargo, the sanctions, and the consequences of the Gulf War. 500,000 children. And Madeleine Albright, who said, "We think the price is worth it," continued not only to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, like Negroponte now is, but then to become the Secretary of State and to receive human rights awards and be welcomed in public and be a respected commentator. The retired generals and the military experts that we hear on the television tell us that in this new war we're about to fight, we're going to be using smart weapons. No civilians are going to be targeted. No innocent people are going to be targeted. We have all this sophisticated technology. But they don't tell you that during the Gulf War, 2/3 of the smart weapons fired by the United States missed their targets. 2/3. And the third that hit their targets hit civilian infrastructure, hit basic necessities that the Iraqi people need to have safe drinking water, to have electricity, to have refrigeration, to have power, and that was done deliberately. Do we think that the United States is going to behave any differently in a war on Afghanistan, one of the world's poorest countries? They also neglect to say that during the time since the Gulf War, they say they develop all these new weapons, this new technology. There's even this debate, should we be bombing Iraq? I'm not sure if people have followed this debate. Well, the United States is bombing Iraq. They're bombing Iraq on a regular basis. In fact, they escalated the bombings last week. A few months ago, the United States dropped cluster bombs on Iraq. These are cluster bombs that cover an area the size of a football field with mini bomblets, many of which do not explode upon impact, but are left later on for children and others to come along and pick up. And they're colorful and they're attractive to children. 93% of those smart weapons missed their intended targets. 93%. That's the sophisticated technology that the U.S. Military is bringing in onto the world stage. In Afghanistan, people are already starving. People are already hungry. People are already homeless. People are already refugees within and from the country. Afghanistan has suffered 3 years of drought. The food and aid agencies have already withdrawn in anticipation of military strikes on Afghanistan. And I think we have to be very clear. Any war on Afghanistan is going to make the world a more dangerous, not a safer place. It's going to make the world a more unstable place. It's going to hurt civilians, no matter what they say. It's going to hurt innocent people who had no responsibility for September 11th. It's going to risk a wider war, and a wider war that we should be clear involves nuclear-armed powers like Pakistan and India, which have a conflict over Kashmir. It's already providing a cover for Israel to seize more Palestinian land, for Hindu fundamentalists in India to rage against Muslims in that country, for Russians to press their campaign against Muslim insurgents in Chechnya. And it's going to breed more resentment, and it's going to bring more hostility around the world against U.S. imperialism. That's why we have to do everything that we can to mobilize against this war and make sure that the tragedy of September 11th is not compounded by more tragedies and by more violence. Now, I want to end with one small point and let Howard speak. The anti-war movement is growing incredibly quickly around this country. I'm amazed at the reports that I've seen, the stories that I've heard. People have been turned away from teach-ins around the country, from organizing meetings and demonstrations. wildly exceeding people's expectations. Even the New York Times had an article last week saying that at Ground Zero in New York City, where people most directly experienced the tragedy of September 11th, the sentiment is overwhelmingly against war. If you haven't seen that article, go read it and show it to everyone you know, because people saw directly what violence means to their lives. And people around the country are voicing their opposition against the racist attacks that we've seen against Arabs, against Sikhs, against Muslims, against South Asians, against any people of color who can be identified in this environment as standing out, as being somehow the other. And we have seen amazing work done under very difficult circumstances. I think that we need, at the present moment, to make sure that we're not just fighting a defensive battle, but that we're also saying a few things about what we're fighting for. And I just want to say a couple of things about that. We know that this war that they want to pursue is only going to breed more inequality, more violence, more resentment, and yes, it's ultimately going to breed more terrorism, and that we're clearly opposed to that. I hope we can all agree that we're opposed to that. But I think we also need to put forward a vision of eradicating the roots of terrorism, eradicating the injustice, eradicating the poverty, eradicating the military conflicts that are at the root of terrorism, not just the terrorism of September 11th, but the terrorism that we see in other places around the world. We need to talk about the fact that the $343 billion that the Pentagon is spending this year would be far better spent on education, healthcare, demining in Afghanistan. And how's about helping the 1.3 billion people in the world who don't have access to safe drinking water get access to safe drinking water? How's that for a start? How's about that the money that they're spending to arm right-wing death squads in Colombia be better spent on drug treatment programs here? And rather than bleeding hospitals of supplies in Iraq, how's about building more public hospitals and healthcare here in the United States? And instead of dropping bombs on Afghanistan, how's about sending demining teams to get rid of the 10 million landmines that are scattered throughout that country because the legacy of the U.S. Role in that country? We need to talk about alternatives to a world in which nuclear and environmental destruction are a clear and present danger. They're not abstract dystopian possibilities. They are real possibilities, given that we live in a world that is so driven by the profit motive, so driven by militarism, so driven by the interests of such a small minority in the world. And I think if the world we see around us is so clearly awry, we need to talk about what we can do to set it aright, collectively to work to set it aright. And I'll just end with a quote from Eugene Debs, who I think is one of the most inspiring anti-war activists that we can look to as we build our anti-war movement. He was an American socialist. He was jailed for his opposition to World War I. And this is what he had to say. My sympathy is with the struggling, suffering people everywhere. It matters not under what flag they were born or where they live. I sympathize with them all, and I would, if I could, establish a social system that would embrace them all.
Our next speaker is a lifelong activist and fighter for social justice. He's the author of the classic, A People's History of the United States, currently being adopted for TV by HBO. He's also the author of the play Marx in Soho, his autobiography You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, and is a contributor to the new book Three Strikes, The Fighting Spirit of Labor's Last Century. Please welcome Howard Zinn.
Well, this That's a great turnout. Don't you think so? Really? Great. It's really heartwarming to see these people who can't get seats standing up through all of this. Well, Anthony started to talk about history, and I'll just continue where he left off, because I will just follow him, whatever he says. He's my editor, and I feel very subservient. They, you know who they is? There's a they and a we, right? There's they and there's we. That's the world. And they want us to forget history. They want us to act as if we were born yesterday. Because if you forget history, if you were born yesterday, then you will believe anything. Anytime the president or any official gets up before the microphone and tells you, well, this is what happened and this is what we must do, well, if you have no history, if you have no memory, well, how can you check up? How can you know? Especially when from the time you were in grade school, you will pledge allegiance to the flag, right? You were disciplined right from the start and told to obey the rules and listen to the people in authority. And the same things that they told you in elementary school about obeying authority. Notice the enormous move to obey the president. Did you see in the newspapers, our news commentators are objective people, right? You go to journalism school and they talk very seriously about objectivity, report and so on and so forth. And then there are these anchor people. What are they anchored to? You say, they're anchored to the establishment. That's why they're called anchor people, you see. And one of these anchor people, Dan Rather, was quoted, some of you may have seen this, was quoted as saying sometime last week, I saw this in the International Herald Tribune. This is one of those one-upmanship things, Who reads the International Herald Tribune? I do. You see. But I saw this in the International Herald Tribune. And Dan Rather was quoted on national television as saying, he's the president. When the president says, get in line, I get in line. Now, this, you know what I immediately thought of? Totalitarianism. Really, I thought that's what we used to say, our leader has spoken, get in line, don't ask questions, and our leaders are wise. That's, well, but what's encouraging is that there are people in this room and people in rallies and gatherings all over this country who are not getting in line. And that's a very comforting thought. They want us to forget the history of governments and the history of our government. I.F. Stone, some of you may have heard of, one of the great journalists of the 20th century. I.F. Stone would be invited to speak to journalism classes, and he would say to these people who are going to be journalists, he said, look, if you really want to be a good journalist, you just have to remember 2 words. Governments lie, you see. And that is a fact. I mean, not just our government, but governments lie. Does this sound like an anarchist statement? You see? And, no, anarchism is a philosophy. Anarchism isn't a bunch of hoodlums going around. That's not anarchism, that's the government, you see. But the anarchist philosophers, and I'm not talking about those few anarchists who decided to imitate the government and throw a bomb here or there, assassinate. No, the anarchists in general, anarchists as a philosophical group of organizers, Emma Goldman and Peter Kropotkin and Alexander Berkman, they understood the nature of governments, and the nature of governments is to lie. Well, for a very simple reason, because if governments told the truth, they wouldn't be in power very long, you see. And so it's very, very important to know the history of governments, very important to know the history of American governments, right? And to think of how, especially in wartime, and there's something about wartime that brings out prevarication. Yes, lies. But, I've never used the word prevarication publicly. I thought I would try it out tonight. You see. Look at, there's something about war that brings it out, And so, the Mexican War. I know all of you remember the Mexican War. How do you think we got Texas, and Colorado, and Arizona, and New Mexico, and California? Because the Mexicans liked us and gave it to us. They're kind people. They have that Latin generosity, you see. But it was in the Mexican War that we acquired that territory, roughly half of Mexico, and we thought the Mexicans should be grateful we didn't take all of Mexico, you see. But the Mexican War started with a lie, Oh, wow. There's always an incident and a lie. And so there was this incident on the border, the Texas-Mexican border between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River, and American troops go into this disputed territory. There's a clash, people are killed, and the president, I started to say goes before the microphone, but I guess, no, they didn't have that. President Polk announces to the country that American blood has been shed on American soil. So, later, many, many years later, when I heard President Bush, the elder, say, they've insulted an American soldier in Panama. What are we going to do about it? Oh, no, actually, an American soldier's wife, because I forgot, he's a feminist. And this must not be allowed, you see. But, American blood has been shed on American soil, and soon, the armies are there on their way to Mexico City, and soon we have, as I say, half of Mexico. Lies. 1898, the battleship Maine is sunk in Havana Harbor. And by the way, nobody asks, when they discuss, and they always come, there's one thing you learn about American history. You learn about the battleship Maine. There's about 7 things you learn about in American history, and one is the sinking of the Maine. and how that led to the Spanish-American War. And in none of the textbooks that deal with it, and I'm sure none of the classes that deal with it, certainly none of the classes that I ever attended that dealt with American history, does anybody ask the question, what was the battleship Maine doing in Havana Harbor? You know, it's like when the American destroyer was attacked, right? In Yemen, right? I didn't see any newscasters ask, what was an American destroyer doing way, way out there? You know, like the Gulf of, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident took place in 1964, oh wow, they've attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. But where is the Gulf of Tonkin? It's, I guess it must be off the coast of San Francisco. Because maybe if you really showed a map and showed where the Gulf of Tonkin is, you might ask, what were American destroyers doing off the coast of Vietnam, so far from home, you see? But lies were told about that. And the lies that were told about that led immediately to Congress passing resolutions giving, does that sound familiar? Congress passing resolutions giving the president full power to do whatever he wants to do in the Gulf of Tonkin, leading to a 10-year war in Vietnam which cost several million lives. Another lesson from history, don't trust Congress. Don't believe in checks and balances. That stuff that you got in junior high school. Oh, what a wonderful system we have. One branch will check the other branch. And that way, nothing bad can happen, you see. No. In time of war, Congress is always a flock of sheep, you see. And so is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't fool around with war, however unconstitutional war is. Whatever rights are being taken away by the war, the Supreme Court will not defend those constitutional rights. Well, Anthony mentioned Debs. The Supreme Court voted unanimously that Debs should go to jail for speaking out against the war. Hey, what about the First Amendment? Like the members of the Supreme Court never read the First Amendment to the Constitution. It doesn't matter. It's time of war. Time of war, we all become yes men, all of them. The Congress, the Supreme Court, and so, there you have, just as happened last week, Congress, at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin, voting almost unanimously in the House, almost unanimously in the Senate, almost 2 dissenting votes by Senators Wayne Morse and Gruning, and that if people knew some history and heard about this near unanimous vote, the one heroic vote against it by the African-American Congresswoman from California, Barbara Lee, you see. If people knew some history, if the teachers gave them history, if the media gave people a little history, if anybody with power over our communications network gave people some history, they might recognize in this rush of Congress towards war, they might recognize that same subservience that Congress has always shown when it comes to matters of war. So history can be useful. History can come in handy to tell you something about governments, to tell you something about the structure of governments, to tell you something about deceptions and lies. Because if people knew that history, they wouldn't simply sit back and listen to Bush and sort of be impressed by the fact that he knows how to read, you see. The media, too, I mean, you think in a democratic country there'd be, and I remember when I was taking courses in political science, when I foolishly took courses in political science, they would talk about, very soberly, seriously, about pluralism, American pluralism, you know, all the different divergent ideas and so on in the United States. But in times of crisis, there's no pluralism. There's one voice. And so when Bush gives that speech, as he did last week, everybody, all of the media, and all of the television experts rushing before the camera saying, what a beautiful speech. Did you notice his face? Did you notice, you know, the way he timed his words? None of them had anything to say about the substance of his speech, because that's not important, because it doesn't matter what the substance is, we'll do what he says, you see. We must learn something about the history of governments and the history of the relationship of people to governments. And must learn something about what democracy is. Democracy is not falling in line behind the president. Democracy is for people to think independently, to be skeptical of government, to check up for themselves, to look around and try to find out what's going on. And then, if they see that the government is deceiving them, to speak out as loudly as they can. That's democracy. Well, Anthony was giving you some of the history of American foreign policy, particularly with regard to Iraq, but that's a history that needs to be recalled. I'm not going to recall it all for you. It would take a while, because our foreign policy has been very full. You know, we're not Switzerland, you see. We are a great power. A great power has a lot of foreign policy. Most of it bad, you say. But the history of our foreign policy is very important, because without it, we will not understand how much animosity we have engendered in various parts of the world, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere. We won't be able to understand that. If we don't have any history, we will live our lives with the kind of things we were taught in elementary school, that the United States is a force for democracy and liberty in the world. And we have been the Boy Scouts of the world, you know, helping countries across the street, you know. And, you know, and but to study the history of American foreign policy is to study the history of an imperial power, a power that took over from the British Empire and the French and the German and the Russian and the Dutch empires, and that established the most powerful empire of all after World War II. And it sent its troops all over the world and sent its ships all over the seas and intervened again and again in places so far from home. Nobody could talk about it as being defensive. And in its foreign policy, consigned several million people to their deaths. And in this foreign policy supported terrorist governments in various parts of the world, especially in Central America, especially in the Middle East. So the history of American foreign policy is a very important thing to know. And I'm stressing all this because I think that we all need to become communicators of this history, because since the public is not getting the history in the schools, the public is not getting the history from television or from the newspapers, it then becomes the job of informed citizens to do the kind of education that is lacking in the major media and in the culture. Because, and here's what I found, that as soon as people get a little of this history, it makes sense to them. They recognize it. You know, all this stuff about, 90% of the American people support Bush. Sure, you know, because their memories have been wiped out, because they're treated as if they were born yesterday. And I have found in talking to people, and I think this is important to keep in mind, that as soon as you begin telling people a little bit, reminding people a little bit, hey, remember Vietnam? Hey, remember the Gulf War and all the hoopla and the yellow ribbons and so on, and now, you know, all these people in Iraq are dead as a result of our no. Remember, as soon as people think a little, and learn a little history, as soon as you tell them something about the history of terrorism, and you point out to them all the times that terrorist acts have been committed, and what has happened when governments have used force to say, we are going to stamp out terrorism, just as in this case. And then there's more terrorism. And then there's more force. And of course, the force isn't called terrorism, but it is. Because anytime you use violence indiscriminately and kill innocent people, you are engaging in terrorism. You see? And so we have to broaden our definition of terrorism. And we have to think that this awful thing that happened on September 11th, yes, we need to feel deeply about that and feel for the victims of that and feel for the families of that, but we also need to learn from it. And we all need also to, when we remember the scenes, remember the scenes of the people racing in shock from those fires, and the scenes of people crushed under the weight of the buildings. We ought to remember that these are scenes that have taken place in various parts of the world for a long time, and that therefore we need to see terrorism as an international phenomenon. The United States is not the only victim, and American citizens are not the only victims of terrorism. Because if we are going to have one world, if we are really, you know, it's interesting that people talk about globalization and free flow of markets and free markets, but they don't talk about international solidarity of people. They don't say that we should consider people everywhere in the world as our brothers and sisters, that we should see the children all over the world as our children, and therefore we mustn't bomb these places. We mustn't use military force because this is all one human family, and we must not do damage to any members, you know, of this family. This is, you know. Just one more thing about remembering and not being born yesterday. Let's remember that the American people, Lincoln was right. You can fool some of the people all the time, all of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. Remember? and Lincoln, and he's right, because if people do wake up, people do learn, people do come to their senses after that first wave of, support the government. People do look around, and their common sense and their common humanity tells them, and we've seen this in the past, tells them something is wrong here. People woke up to what was happening to black people in the South at a certain point, and then whites joined the movement, and it became a national movement. People learned after a while what was happening, what we were doing to people in Vietnam, and they woke up and we had a great national movement. So never think because of the polls, or never think because of the huzzas for the president that come from the press and the the anchors, never think that they are going to have it their way and the people will be fooled all of the time. We've seen movements grow from groups of people like this gathered all over the country to great national movements. We need another one today, and we may be on the way to one. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take some questions now, if people want to do that. There's a microphone up at the front here, and we're going to take 3 at once. So people can line up, and then we're going to take 3 people's questions. We'll go through the speakers. So we want to give people a second just to line up. So we had a last-minute change of format, so if we want to do 5 questions at once. So. Okay. Yeah. So please keep your sentences down to 1 minute and in the form of a question.
Hello? Okay, my name is Jake. My name is Jacob, and I'm with the Spartacus Youth Club. We're a socialist organization. I just wanted to say something that I don't think was said, but that is that capitalism, a system of social organization based on private property and the production for profit, inevitably causes the drive for war. Already 2 world wars, and already they're gearing up for another war. And that while we condemn the World Trade Center attack, it's just as necessary to note that the crimes of U.S. imperialism, millions of people from the nuclear assault on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the attack on Iraq, and in between from Vietnam and Korea, U.S. imperialism has the bloodiest hands in the world. And whoever did this terror, one of the important things to note is that they, by equating the rulers with the ruled, aped the same worldview of the U.S. imperialists. So we seek to mobilize the working class in this country and internationally to smash capitalism. Yes, okay, here's my question. Mr. Arnov from the ISO, a so-called socialist organization, spoke to the point that perhaps it would be better to build factories and not bomb them. Does he actually believe that the bloodthirsty U.S. imperialists are a force for progress in the world, and that by appealing to either of them in their Democratic or Republican guise, that the workers can get something out of them? We disagree, and we think that the working class needs to overthrow capitalism.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Hello. I was going to ask the speaker before, Mr. Zinn, what were the sources for the statistics about the smart bombs and how much missed, and where can we find good information, that kind of information? I can't wade through the thousands of things that I'm supposed to get through to know has some accuracy or validity.
Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to thank all of you guys for speaking. Like, I haven't heard a lot of good progressive education in a long time. And, like, I was raised on John Dewey, so, like, I mean, you guys are, I mean... And the other thing I wanted to say was, like, look around, like, look how many of us there are here. Like, I didn't know there were this many other American kids who, like, cared about peace and stuff. I think this is awesome! Yeah. Those are just, those two things. Also, yeah. Okay, I would address a comment to Howard. I'm sorry I'm taking up so much time. I just wanted to thank you for all the cool stuff you've written over the years. Like, me and my friends, we sit around and read your books and stuff, and it's really swell. I think your ideas on the nature of American imperialism and the way that our society works are very provocative. And I think that lens enables us to, like, I think that lens enables us to reevaluate our society in the way that the framers intended, and I think that is very, very valuable.
Thanks.
Oh, and also, thank you for the freedom schools, and, like, my question is, were you a pilot in Second World War? I heard that somewhere.
We need to get 5 questions so we can answer them. So 1 minute each, please, and in the form of a question.
My name is Sarah. I'm from Emerson. I have a question for all the speakers. I've been having a lot of trouble with this issue because a lot of times a lot of people are looking at us like we're just, flaky hippies that are preaching peace. And, they have a very concrete solution, and that is war. And I'm having a hard time with the argument against that because I don't really have very many concrete solutions to war, and I was wondering if you do. We have the international court system. But in order for our voice to be heard, we need to have concrete solutions to offer instead of war, and so I was just wondering what your issues are. Thank you.
I'm wondering if, I guess this would be for any of the speakers, in the last week, the emphasis on getting ready for a long war, we're witnessing the national leaders trying to find an alternative to communism, which was the excuse that was used over many decades, trying to protect us from the communist menace that's being now replaced with protecting us from the terrorist menace, and that's going to replace communism as the big boogeyman that will excuse all of the different activities around the world. If that's true, because we have to prop up our militarist economy, is there, like, things you might say about economic conversion, or are there alternatives to that future, if you think that is what they're having in mind?
Thanks. Take one more. One more.
Hello. My name is C.C. Oshagra. I'm a local poet. And as far as the peace movement goes and the communication that we're receiving from the top down, I believe that there's been some talk about what the peace movement can do and what they could rally behind, to use that word with a bit of fright maybe. But I've been listening to the wars over the last few years, and I believe that the basis of almost every war that we fought lately has been backed by globalization and backed by big corporate money that does not care about peace or democracy. And I believe that George Bush is not of the people, for the people, or by the people. I believe that George W. Bush is of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the multinational corporations and big oil. And my question is, 3 words, and I want everybody to learn about it, ask about it, and keep it in the media dialogue, and that is liquid hydrogen now. Liquid hydrogen now.
Thanks. All right, so we're going to just run those all by the speakers really quickly so we can get on to some more questions. So if we can... 3 more? 3 more. All right, so we're going to do 3 more, actually. We want to do 3 more, and then so we can just get through all these questions at once, and just to wrap it up. Thanks.
Okay, if smart bombs don't work very well, and racism is bad, and the U.S. committing terrorism is bad, where we kill civilians, how should we react to September 11th? Specifically, what should we do? Everyone has great ideas here, but how are we specifically going to address what happened on September 11th?
I'd like to address the woman who spoke second, and this is a meeting about non-racism, and I believe that your speech felt more like passing the basket of racism to Israel, from like the Arabs and Muslim group to the Israelis, and I don't think that what you did was correct for the people here listening, because it really was painful to listen to your speech, because I appreciate history and I appreciate truth, but I don't appreciate warping that truth to make us more racist. It's individuals, not groups, not countries, individuals.
I wanted to say quickly, I was talking to a friend of mine last week who spent years on death row wrongfully accused, and we were talking about the war, and he said, this country now wants vengeance. And he was talking about the death penalty. He said, the problem is, he was talking about how he got put on death row and he was wrongly accused. He said, you know, when someone close to you is killed, your first reaction is to want vengeance. But then, when you begin to watch what giving this government and this state the power to enact vengeance means, you find that very often the people it enacts vengeance on are not the people that you expected. And that the people who ended up on death row are there because they're poor and they're black, and many of them are even innocent. And I think now, as we run up to war, we're being told that this is a war for vengeance and for revenge. And I really just had a question for all the speakers about, I remember the war in Haiti for democracy and a humanitarian war in Somalia. And we left those countries worse off than when we went into it. I wish maybe the speakers can talk a little bit more about some of the more recent wars that we said we were going into for, so quote unquote just reasons.
Thanks. So is that three? Is that yeah, we'll all speak. Okay, do you want to just each get up, or do you want to?
I just want to thank everyone for all the great questions. I wanted to just talk a little bit about, 2 people brought up, what can we do? How can we solve this? What's a concrete solution? I'm not up here to say that I have a concrete solution, but I'm up here to talk about a process in which we could get to a concrete solution. I'm a scientist, and so I use the thought process that I use to do good science to make decisions about things that are going on around me in the world. And as a scientist, you use something called the scientific inquiry. And not that, for those of you that are also scientists, not that it's completely unbiased, but when I have a problem that I'm trying to solve in my research as an oceanographer, I don't have the answer beforehand. I have a question I'm trying to answer, and I step back and I try to look at all the different ways that I can attack that problem. I don't decide beforehand that Osama bin Laden has done this and then look for evidence to fit my answer. Instead, I say, okay, we have a problem. The World Trade Center has been attacked by 2 airplanes, and another plane went for the Pentagon. Why did this happen? How did this happen? What were the reasons that would cause someone to do this? And what are the situations that push someone to do this violence? And that's all I can offer, is that we need to take a step back and analyze why something like this would happen and what we can do in the future to prevent it. But we can't already decide that the problem We can't already decide what the answer is without doing a proper and thorough investigation.
I think all of your questions were really great, and I appreciate that people stayed. I also want to just address quickly what can we do or what should we do, and I think part of it is we have to get through our pain and shock, and as an Arab American, people, ask, well, where's your loyalty? Did you also grieve? We lost people in these tragedies too, and it's not often acknowledged. I think another thing that we have to do is be informed and learn from history, as I think all of us have been saying. And why is Israel central to all this? Well, go to the rest of the world and ask the different communities and different peoples and countries around the world how they feel about U.S. policy and how it has enraged people around the world, especially in the Middle East, that the U.S. has been so unilaterally in support of this one country at the expense of the Palestinian people, and to the point now where even our allies in that region, our so-called allies that sit on the oil that we want, are also sitting on a time bomb because their peoples are also very upset. I'm a Palestinian. I've been to the occupied territories 4 times in the last 2 years. And it's a wonder that, not that there is this terror, but there isn't more terror. So I think that, yeah, people may be upset to refer to Israel, but it's not a sacred cow anymore, and we should be able to bring it into the conversation just like we do other places.
I'd also like to add that I'm Jewish. I visited the occupied territories recently, and I'm as outraged as Suad, as a Palestinian, about human rights abuses in Israel as I'm outraged by human rights abuses conducted by any state anywhere. And we have to talk about those abuses because they're sponsored and funded by the United States government with our tax dollars, and I think we have a responsibility to address them. And because they're going to create more violence, not only in the Middle East, but around the world. Just really quickly, on good sources of information, there's a lot. There's some literature tables right out here in the hallway where you can get good magazines, good newspapers, and I don't think any of the things we're talking about tonight are that hard to find if you read the papers with a critical eye, and if you're trying to find out other people who, like Howard was talking about, are trying to get beyond the story that we're being told by Dan Rather. Just very quickly on concrete solutions, because I think it's coming up over and over again for those of us who are trying to come to grips with what happened on September 11th and who are trying to organize against this war and to talk to people about it in our workplaces and in our families and amongst our friends. And I just have a very simple question. How is the killing of more innocent people going to be an adequate response to the killing of innocent people on September 11th? How is the sponsorship of more terrorism and more violence going to be a way to honor those who needlessly died on September 11th? And how long can the United States continue to be allowed to violate the rights of people around the world and expect that we'll not experience the blowback that Howard talked about? We have to ask those very tough questions. And I think that the best way that we can honor the people whose lives were needlessly taken on September 11th is to build an anti-war movement and to build for a world without war. We start today in building the anti-war movement, and in that struggle talk about how we can win that kind of world. Yeah, I'll give it to you.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's in here.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry to say, we're not going to be able to take any more questions because we got to go. We're very important people. have really important things to do. No, but you can grab somebody and throw your question at them, and anyway, a lot of your questions are really rhetorical questions because you know the answer. And so I'm just going to follow up on what Anthony said about people do want to know, what can we do? They feel you must be able to do something, and it's very, very tough because you have to. I think you really have to. Yeah, you have to start by saying there are times when there is no immediate solution to a deep-rooted problem. And when medical students are in medical school and, they're taught the oath of Hippocrates, and they're taught that, look, if you face a medical problem where you know there's something deeply wrong there, but you don't know what to do about it, the first rule is do no harm. And it's very important to know that. You start off from that point, you do no harm. And then you think, well, what can we really do? First you know what you can't do. You can't make things worse than they are. You can't match violence with violence. What can you do? Oh, sure, you can take security measures. Sure, you can apprehend these particular criminals, but you know that is not going to solve the problem. People have to understand that for some problems, there is no short-term solution. There is no quick fix. When you want a quick fix, you will do something dangerous. And so you have to think about what are the roots of the problem, what is the long-term solution, and you don't have to wait for the long-term solution. You can start immediately on a long-term solution. And the way you can start immediately on a long-term solution is by withdrawing American military power from those areas of the world where it has caused great anger, and announce to the world that we are not going to spend billions on Star Wars. We're not going to spend billions for more weapons to continue what we've done before. We're going to spend billions. We're going to take these billions, and we are going to become a true force, not for military power in the world, but for social development in the world. We can use those billions to do something about AIDS in Africa, to do something about tuberculosis, to do something about poverty in the Middle East. We're going to do something that is constructive and not destructive. And in the long run, that is the only solution. That is the only solution there is. Anyway, thank you.
If anybody makes any announcements, we have the mic up here. You can just get in line. All right, I'll make an announcement. This Sunday at 5:30 at 96 Beacon Street, Emerson College, we're, building this student anti-war movement. So if anybody wants to come, 5:30, 96 Beacon Street on Sunday.
For those of you who are interested in alternative sources of information and have access to the World Wide Web, I will give you the names of 3 very good sources of alternative information on the web. The first is commondreams.org, O-R-G for organization. The second is ZMAG, Z-M-A-G.org for organization. That's the site run by the Z Magazine folks. And the third is counterpunch.org, also for organization. ZMAG, Common Dreams, and counterpunch.org, all excellent sources for alternative viewpoints, activism, and other alternative information. Secondly, information about upcoming events. On Tuesday evenings from 6 to 7 for the next weeks, there will be a regular vigil at Copley Square organized by the American Friends Service Committee and other peace groups and other activist groups. And that's every Tuesday at 6 o'clock, a vigil at Copley Square. This coming Sunday, September 30th, an ad hoc coalition is in the process of planning a major public event scheduled for this Sunday, September 30th in Boston. Information will be posted, flyers will be put out, and if you want information, check with the American Friends Service Committee in Cambridge, and I have a telephone number for that. And finally, some of the people who have organized these vigils are publicizing a protest for the day after any major U.S. military attack, and you can also get in touch with the American Friends Service Committee about further information for that. Thank you.